2. A tour of the tunnel. The one world problem, the unity of consciousness. Once upon a time, I had to write an encyclopedia article on consciousness. The first thing I did was to photocopy all existing encyclopedia articles on the topic I could find and track down the historical references. I wanted to know whether in the long history of Western philosophy there was a common philosophical insight running like a thread through humanity's perennial endeavor to understand the conscious mind. To my surprise, I found two such essential insights. The first is that consciousness is a higher-order form of knowledge accompanying thoughts and other mental states. The Latin concept of conscientious, the original root from which all later terminologies in English and the Romance languages developed. This in turn is derived from come, with, together, and scire, to know. In classical antiquity, as well as in the scholastic philosophy of the Christian Middle Ages, conscientia typically referred either to moral conscience or to knowledge shared by certain groups of people, again, most commonly of moral ideas. Interestingly, being truly conscious was connected to moral insight. Isn't it a beautiful notion that becoming conscious in the true sense could be related to moral conscience? Philosophers would have a new definition of the entity they call a zombie, an amoral person, ethically fast asleep but with eyes wide open. In any case, many of the classical theories stated that becoming conscious had to do with installing an ideal observer in your mind, an inner witness providing moral guidance as well as a hidden, entirely private knowledge about the contents of your mental states. Consciousness connected your thoughts with your actions by submitting them to the moral judgment of the ideal observer. Whatever we may think about these early theories of consciousness as conscience today, they certainly possessed philosophical depth and great beauty. Consciousness was an inner space providing a point of contact between the real human being and the ideal one inside, the only space in which you could be together with God even before death. From the time of René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, however, the philosophical interpretation of conscientious simply as higher-order knowledge of mental states began to predominate. It has to do with certainty. In an important sense, consciousness is knowing that you know while you know. The second important insight seems to be the notion of integration. Consciousness is what binds things together into a comprehensive, simultaneous whole. If we have this whole, then a world appears to us. If the information flow from your sensory organs is unified, you experience the world. If your senses come apart, you lose consciousness. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant or Franz Brentano have theorized about this unity of consciousness. What exactly is it that, at every single point in time, blends all the different parts of your conscious experience into one single reality? Today it is interesting to note that the first essential insight, knowing that you know something, is mainly discussed in philosophy of mind, whereas the neuroscience of consciousness focuses on the problem of integration, how the features of objects are bound together. The latter phenomenon, the one-world problem of dynamic, global integration, is what we must examine if we want to understand the unity of consciousness. But in the process, we may discover how both these essential questions, the top-down version discussed in philosophy of mind and the bottom-up version discussed in the neurosciences, are two sides of the same coin.
What would it be like to have the experience of living in many worlds at the same time, of genuine parallel realities opening up in your mind? Would there be parallel observers, too? The one-world problem is so simple that it is easily overlooked. In order for a world to appear to us, it has to be one world first. For most of us, it seems obvious that we live our conscious lives in a single reality, and the world we wake up to every morning is the same world we woke up to the day before. Our tunnel is one tunnel. There are no back alleys, side streets, or alternative routes. Only people who have suffered severe psychiatric disorders or have experimented with major doses of hallucinogens can perhaps conceive of what it means to live in more than one tunnel at a time. The unity of consciousness is one of the major achievements of the brain. It is the not-so-simple phenomenological fact that all the contents of your current experience are seamlessly correlated, forming a coherent whole, the world in which you live your life. But the problem of integration has to be solved on several subglobal levels first. Imagine you are no longer able to bind the various features of a seen object, its color, surface texture, edges, and so on, into a single entity. In a disorder known as apperceptive agnosia, no coherent visual model emerges on the level of conscious experience, despite the fact that all the patient's low-level visual processes are intact. Sufferers typically have a fully intact visual field that is consciously perceived, but they are unable to recognize what it is they are looking at. They cannot distinguish shapes from or match shapes with each other, for example, or copy drawings. Apperceptive agnosia is usually caused by a lack of oxygen supply to the brain, for instance, through carbon monoxide poisoning. Patients may well have a coherent, integrated visual world model, but certain types of visual information are no longer available to them to act upon. On a functional level, they cannot use Gestalt grouping cues or figure/ground cues to organize their visual field. Now imagine you are no longer able to integrate your perception of an object with the categorical knowledge that would allow you to identify it, and you consequently cannot subjectively experience what it is you are perceiving, as in asterognosia, the inability to recognize objects by touch, typically associated with lesions in two regions of the primary somatosensory cortex, or autotopagnosia, the inability to identify and name one's own body parts, also associated with cortical lesions. There are also patients suffering from what has been called disjunctive agnosia, who cannot integrate seeing and hearing, whose conscious life seems to be taking place in a movie with the wrong soundtrack. As one patient described his experience, someone was standing in front of me and I could see his mouth moving, but I noticed that the mouth moving did not belong to what I heard. Now, what if everything came apart? There are neurological patients with wounded brains who describe shattered worlds, but in these cases there is at least some kind of world left, something that could be experienced as having been shattered in the first place. If the unified, multimodal scene, the here and now, the situation as such, dissolves completely, we simply go blank. The world no longer appears to us.
A number of new ideas and hypotheses in the neurosciences suggest how this world-binding function works. One such is the dynamical core hypothesis, which posits that a highly integrated and internally differentiated neurodynamic pattern emerges from the constant background chatter of millions of neurons incessantly firing away. Giulio Tononi, a neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who is a leading advocate of this hypothesis, speaks of a functional cluster of neurons. Whereas I have coined the concept of causal density, the basic idea is simple. The global neurocorrelate of consciousness is like an island emerging from the sea. As noted, it is a large set of neuroproperties underlying consciousness as a whole, underpinning your experiential model of the world in its totality at any given moment. The global NCC has many different levels of description. Dynamically, we can describe it as a coherent island, made of densely coupled relations of cause and effect, emerging from the waters of a much less coherent flow of neural activity. Or we could adopt a neurocomputational perspective and look at the global NCC as something that results from information processing in the brain and hence functions as a carrier of information. At this point, it becomes something more abstract, which we might envision as an information cloud hovering above a neurobiological substrate. The border of this information cloud is functional, not physical. The cloud is physically realized by widely distributed firing neurons in your head. Just like a real cloud, which is made of tiny water droplets suspended in the air, the neuronal activation pattern underlying the totality of your conscious experience is made of millions of tiny electrical discharges and chemical transitions at the synapses. In strict terms, it has no fixed location in the brain, though it is coherent. But why is it coherent? What holds all the droplets, all the micro-events, together? We do not yet know, but there are some indications that the unified whole appears by virtue of the temporal fine structure characterizing the conscious brain's activity. That is, the rhythmic dance of neuronal discharges and synchronous oscillations. This is why the border of this whole is a functional border, outlining the island of consciousness in an ocean made up of a myriad of less integrated and less densely coupled neural micro-events. Whatever information is within this cloud of firing neurons is conscious information. Whatever is within the cloud's boundary, the dynamical core, is part of our inner world. Whatever is outside of it is not part of our subjective reality. Conscious experience can thus be seen as a special global property of the overall neural dynamics of your brain, a special form of information processing based on a globally integrated data format. We also possess the first mathematical instruments that allow us to describe the causal complexity within the dynamical core of consciousness. Technical details aside, they show us how self-organization in our brains strikes an optimal balance between integration and segregation, creating the wonderful richness and diversity of conscious contents and the unity of consciousness at the same time.
What does all this mean? What we want for consciousness is not a uniform state of global synchrony, a state in which many nerve cells simply fire together simultaneously. We find such uniformity in states of unconsciousness such as deep sleep and during epileptic seizures. In these cases, the synchrony wipes out all the internal complexity. It is as if the synchrony had glossed over all the colors and shapes, the objects making up our world. We want large-scale coherence spanning many areas of the brain and flexibly binding many different contents into a conscious hierarchy, the letters into the page into the book, the hand holding the book into your bodily self, and the self sitting in a chair in the room and understanding the words. We want a unity of consciousness that, internally, is as differentiated as possible. On the other hand, maximal differentiation is not optimal either, because then our world would fall apart into unconnected pieces of mental content and we would lose consciousness. The trick with consciousness is to achieve just the right trade-off between the parts and the whole, and at any single moment a widely distributed network of neurons in the brain seems to achieve just that, as a cloud of single nerve cells, dispersed in space, fire away in intricate patterns of synchronous activity, perhaps with one pattern becoming embedded in the next. Just like the water droplets that form a real cloud, some elements leave the aggregate at any given moment, while others join it. Consciousness is a large-scale, unified phenomenon emerging from a myriad of physical micro-events. As long as a sufficiently high degree of internal correlation and causal coupling allows this island of dancing micro-events in your brain to emerge, you live in a single reality. A single, unified world appears to you. This emergence can happen during offline states as well. In dreams, however, the binding of contents does not work quite as well, which is why your dream reality is frequently so bizarre, why you have difficulty focusing your attention, why scenes follow each other so quickly. Nevertheless, there is still an overall situation, you are still present, and that is why phenomenal experience continues. But when you move into deep sleep and the island dissolves back into the sea, your world disappears as well. We humans have known this since Greek antiquity. Sleep is the little brother of death. It means letting go of the world. One of the intriguing characteristics of current research into consciousness is how old philosophical ideas reappear in the best of cutting-edge neuroscience, in new disguise, as it were. Aristotle and Franz Brentano alike pointed out that consciously perceiving must also mean being aware of the fact that one is consciously perceiving, right now, at this very moment. In a certain sense, we must perceive the perceiving while it happens. If this idea is true, the brain state creating your conscious perception of the book in your hand right now must have two logical parts, one portraying the book and one continuously representing the state itself. One part points at the world, and one at itself. Conscious states could be exactly those states that meta-represent themselves while representing something else. This classical idea has logical problems, but the insight itself can perhaps be preserved in an empirically plausible framework.
Work being done by Dutch neuroscientist Victor Lam in Amsterdam and in Stanislas Teheen's lab at the Neurospin Center in the CEA campus of Saclay and at the Petit-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris converges on the central importance of so-called recurrent connections as a functional basis for consciousness. In conscious visual processing, for example, high-level information is dynamically mapped back to low-level information, but it all refers to the same retinal image. Each time your eyes land on a scene, remember, your eye makes about 3 saccades per second, there is a feed-forward feedback cycle about the current image, and that cycle gives you the detailed conscious percept of that scene. You continuously make conscious snapshots of the world via these feed-forward feedback cycles. In a more general sense, the principle is that the almost continuous feedback loops from higher to lower areas create an ongoing cycle, a circular nested flow of information, in which what happened a few milliseconds ago is dynamically mapped back to what is coming in right now. In this way, the immediate past continuously creates a context for the present, it filters what can be experienced right now. We see how an old philosophical idea is refined and spelled out by modern neuroscience on the nuts and bolts level. A standing context loop is created. And this may be a deeper insight into the essence of the world-creating function of conscious experience. Conscious information seems to be integrated and unified precisely because the underlying physical process is mapped back onto itself and becomes its own context. If we apply this idea not to single representations, such as the visual experience of an apple in your hand, but to the brain's unified portrait of the world as a whole, then the dynamic flow of conscious experience appears as the result of a continuous large-scale application of the brain's prior knowledge to the current situation. If you are conscious, the overall process of perceiving, learning, and living creates a context for itself, and that is how your reality turns into a lived reality. Another fascinating scientific route into the one-world problem is increasingly receiving attention. It has long been known that in deep meditation the experience of unity and holistic integration is particularly salient. Thus, if we want to know what consciousness is, why not consult those people who cultivate it in its purest form? Or even better, why not use our modern neuroimaging techniques to look directly into their brains while they maximize the unity and holism of their minds? Antoine Lutz and his colleagues at the W.M. Keck Laboratory for Functional Brain Imaging and Behavior at the University of Wisconsin studied Tibetan monks who had experienced at least 10,000 hours of meditation. They found that meditators self-induced sustained high-amplitude gamma-band oscillations and global phase synchrony, visible in EEG recordings made while they are meditating. The high-amplitude gamma activity found in some of these meditators seems to be the strongest reported in the scientific literature. Why is this interesting? As Metzinger and his co-workers have shown, gamma-band oscillations, caused by groups of neurons firing away in synchrony about 40 times per second, are one of our best current candidates for creating unity and wholeness, although their specific role in this respect is still very much debated. For example, on the level of conscious object perception, these synchronous oscillations often seem to be what makes an object's various features, the edges, color, and surface texture of, say, an apple, cohere as a single unified percept. Many experiments have shown that synchronous firing may be exactly what differentiates an assembly of neurons that gains access to consciousness from one that also fires away but in an uncoordinated manner and thus does not. Synchrony is a powerful causal force. If 1,000 soldiers walk over a bridge together, nothing happens. However, if they march across in lockstep, the bridge may well collapse.
The synchrony of neural responses also plays a decisive role in figure background segregation, that is, the pop-out effect that lets us perceive an object against a background, allowing a new gestalt to emerge from the perceptual scene. Ulrich Ott is Germany's leading meditation researcher, working at the Bender Institute of Neuroimaging at the Justus Liebig Universität in Gießen. He confronted me with an intriguing idea. Could deep meditation be the process, perhaps the only process, in which human beings can sometimes turn the global background into the gestalt, the dominating feature of consciousness itself? This assumption would fit in nicely with an intuition held by many, among others Antoine Lutz, namely that the fundamental subject/object structure of experience can be transcended in states of this kind. Interestingly, this high-amplitude oscillatory activity in the brains of experienced meditators emerges over several dozens of seconds. They can't just switch it on. Instead, it begins to unfold only when the meditator manages effortlessly to step out of the way. The full-blown meditative state emerges only slowly, but this is exactly what the theory predicts. As a gigantic network phenomenon, the level of neural synchronization underlying the unity of consciousness will require more time to develop, because the amount of time required to achieve synchronization is proportional to the size of the neural assembly. In meditation, an orchestrated group of many hundreds of million nerve cells must be formed. The oscillations also correlate with the meditator's verbal reports of the intensity of the meditative experience. That is, oscillations are directly related to reports of intensity. Another interesting finding is that there are significant post-meditative changes to the baseline activity of the brain. Apparently, repeated meditative practice changes the deep structure of consciousness. If meditation is seen as a form of mental training, it turns out that oscillatory synchrony in the gamma range opens just the right time window that would be necessary to promote synaptic change efficiently. To sum up, it would seem that feature binding occurs when the widely distributed neurons that represent the reflection of light, the surface properties, and the weight of, say, this book start dancing together, firing at the same time. This rhythmic firing pattern creates a coherent cloud in your brain, a network of neurons representing a single object, the book, for you at a particular moment. Holding it all together is coherence in time. Binding is achieved in the temporal dimension. The unity of consciousness is thus seen to be a dynamic property of the human brain. It spans many levels of organization, it self-organizes over time, and it constantly seeks an optimal balance between the parts and the whole as they gradually unfold. It shows up on the EEG as a slowly evolving global property, and, as demonstrated by our meditators, it can be cultivated and explored from the inside, from the first-person perspective. Please also see the interview with Wolf Singer at the end of this chapter. But the next problem in formulating a complete theory of consciousness is more difficult.